Hello, friends. It is great to be back behind the TBBT microphones. Raise your hand if you've heard the word infrastructure mentioned in the past week. What about today? What about in the past hour? Infrastructure is front and center on the mind of many, and I guess I feel like I should add the words once again. The American Jobs Plan, as many are aware, was released by the White House, and journalists, opinion providers are spreading the latest buzz on infrastructure. Oh, and also podcasters as well. I'm Bill Colhane, and pleased to welcome you into our studios from here in the ATX, good old Austin, Texas. Rick Jennings, a.k.a. Ricky J, is driving the ship, as always. In the lifespan of our little show, we've delved into infrastructure over the years, right? Our esteemed longtime listeners are well aware that it's been a part of our conversation. Well, we're back. Infrastructure is back. Is this, hold your breath, the time we start to get it right? Coming up a tad later in the episode, we're honored, and that's the right word. We're honored, so pleased to have on Dr. Joseph Schofer from Northwestern University up in Evanston, Illinois. Is going to help us delve into many topics within the vast area of infrastructure. And trust me, you do want to stick around for our conversation with Dr. Schofer. We do need to say hi to Rick. Hi, Rick.
Hey, Bill. I'm pretty excited to get into this one with Dr. Schofer. He's got some really good points to make about U.S. infrastructure and lots of good points here, especially for some listeners of ours who might want to lend their own hand into helping improve the U.S. infrastructure here.
Rick, many know you as the producer and Crazy Bids master of our little show, but you do spend a good portion of your time looking at, analyzing government purchasing. If I said to you, Rick, American Jobs Plan or no American Jobs Plan, U.S. state, local, and federal agencies are mighty busy on infrastructure projects, would you respond, am I correct? Am I incorrect? What says you?
You are 100% correct, Bill. And this is part of an ongoing effort from the U.S. government to repair our lots and lots of infrastructure implements that are decades and decades old at this point. As you'll remember from Season 5, we spoke with Brian Palash from the American Society of Civil Engineers, and we still weren't doing such a good job back in 2019. It does seem to be getting better, but with the American Jobs Plan, I mean, we're looking into like updating our physical infrastructure, of course, electrical, and even as we get into a more technology-based nation, we're looking into like IT and software infrastructure. It all needs to be maintained and updated as best we can, and we're seeing a lot of that come through from purchase orders on the state, local, federal, all kinds of levels that you can imagine throughout the public sector.
Yeah, I see, just looking around doing my own research, there is a lot going on in infrastructure, but as we've talked about for so long, is enough being done? Rick, before you throw the headset back on, I do want to hear, and I know the folks listening, they want to hear what will be happening in Crazy Bids.
I bet. Well, for this episode, I've got a pretty interesting one. This one deals with higher education and accessibility to pretty prestigious schools and education programs that is all like software-based and virtual. So this one is going to be pretty neat to listen to, so stay tuned.
As Rick gets done teasing us about what's coming up later in the episode with Crazy Bids, I received an email, and no, not from a relative or a neighbor, asking if we're ever going to put out Crazy Bids You Can Win t-shirts. Well, thanks for that wonderful idea. I'm not sure if we're going to go. I don't know if we're ready to go there. We'll see on that one. Shortly, our visit with Dr. Schofer, where we delve into a number of important and interesting topics in the world of infrastructure. But first, this.
The Big Bid Theory is brought to you in part by Bid Prime. Over 11 years in changing the bid services industry, Bid Prime has become the solution for businesses serious about winning public sector business. From the premier technology in the industry to real-time bid notifications, supporting documents, and robust data tools, it's all backed by unmatched personalized customer support. Bid Prime. Start your free zero-obligation trial today. Bidprime.com.
Okay, here we go. We will share our conversation with Dr. Schofer. Before I do that, I do want to send many thanks to Megan Fellman from Northwestern for the incredible job that she did in helping to arrange our visit with Dr. Schofer. Let's talk a little bit more about Dr. Schofer, his background. He's a professor of civil engineering and transportation and associate dean at Northwestern's McCormick School of Engineering and Applied Science, along with serving as an associate dean for faculty affairs up there in Evanston. In terms of recognition, professional service, publications, frankly, and I'm being sincere here, the list are beyond impressive. Our marketing folks have included a link to Dr. Schofer's faculty page down there. I'm pointing down there in the description of the podcast. For some time, he is and has been heavily involved in the conversation, study, and analysis of U.S. infrastructure. He's involved with the Transportation Research Board, the National Research Council, the Technical Advisory Committee on Capacity for the Strategic Highway Research Program, and on and on. Last and most certainly not least, he's the host of the Infrastructure Show podcast, and we all know podcast hosts are wonderful people. Dr. Schofer is on the TBBT hotline.
Dr. Joseph Schofer does indeed join us from up in one of my favorite cities on the planet. Some of our longtime listeners know that once upon a time, I don't want to age myself, but back in the early 80s, I spent some time in Illinois down in the central part of the state, but did always enjoy my time up in Chicago, always like getting back to the Windy City. Dr. Schofer, how are things in Chicago today?
It's a beautiful day today. The temperature may start to get warm enough that we can go outside in shorts. We've had some cold weather, but we're blessed. It's a great day.
Very, very nice. Now, in the lead into our conversation, Dr. Schofer, I mentioned you're the host of the Infrastructure Show. Wonderful podcast, by the way. I had the opportunity to listen to a couple of episodes here recently. And having myself over 3 decades in broadcasting, I always find it interesting whenever I'm on the other side of the microphone. In your podcast, you and your guests address, and I lifted it from the intro to your show. You talk about the reality of America's infrastructure, its condition, why it is the way it is, and what can be done about it, quote unquote. Because of that background in broadcasting, I enjoy hearing the backstory on other shows. How did the Infrastructure Show come to be?
It's a bizarre history. I have a colleague, my producer, her name is Marion Sowers. She's a journalist. She came to me out of the blue and said, here's an idea. Do you want to do this? And I was foolish enough to bite on it. That was 12 years ago, and we've done it consistently through that period of time. It's gone through a variety of incarnations, but I will tell you that my motivation in continuing to do this is I'm really curious about how things work, and I'd like to learn how infrastructure works from a variety of perspectives. I'd like to learn it from the experts, and so we work really hard to scout around, and I think we're doing the same thing you're doing. We're looking for people who are experts on certain aspects of infrastructure, and we talk to them for 15 or 20 minutes to try to learn everything we can. And it's really been an opportunity for me to say, hey, I'm really curious about how this works or how that works. Let's find somebody who's a real expert, and she or he will teach us about that. And it's been quite fun.
Again, I'm not just saying that. It is a really fun podcast to listen to. And anybody who has any interest in infrastructure, we know how broad the topic is, but anybody who has any interest in the subject matter, I encourage you to listen in to the Infrastructure Show. So I understand that everybody can look at the description of the podcast, see the date stamp. You and I are sitting here in May of 2021. And I acknowledge, and I'm sure you do, Dr. Schofer, that we could discuss infrastructure nonstop for 24 hours and feel like we haven't even started to scratch the surface. But I do want to talk about ASCE's most recent report card. The grade the U.S. was given by ASCE in this version of the report card was a grade of C-. And you had Emily Feenstra on your show, Emily from ASCE, those listening who aren't familiar with her name. Well, what if you were doing the grading, had to share an overall assessment of U.S. infrastructure? What would you say about how we're doing here in the good old U.S. of A?
I think the problem in doing this grading, and I'll confess to you, I took this question to my graduate class about 4 or 5 weeks ago. I gave them the ASCE report card, and I said, okay, critique the report card and talk to me about how we might do this better, differently. I think, first of all, you have to give ASCE a lot of credit. This is their business. I've been a member for 100 years, and so I have an investment in that organization as well, although I don't play any role in developing the report card. They do this on a shoestring. They do this with volunteer labor, presumably experts in the field. And the constraint that they face, which is really the constraint that we all face in trying to make decisions about infrastructure and to evaluate infrastructure, is finding the data that are really descriptive of condition and performance, as opposed to, for example, age. So I don't know your age. I know my age, and I hope people don't evaluate my capability to do some things, at least mental things, based on my age. And I don't want to evaluate infrastructure that way either. I want to know what the condition is. For some elements of the infrastructure, we know a lot. And for some, we know very little. And so where we know very little, it's hard to give a grade unless we say, well, if it's old, it's not good. And I wouldn't do that. And I don't think that makes sense. So I would say that the condition of the infrastructure is highly variable. It's more variable than what comes out in the press releases from ASCE. So it's more attractive to focus on the components that are in the worst condition. But the fact is that civil engineers get a lot of credit for non-failure of infrastructure. And when there is a failure, so what was the most recent failure I can think of? Well, the DeSoto Bridge that carries I-40 from Arkansas to Tennessee at Memphis is closed now because there's a very substantial crack in one of the beams. This doesn't happen very, very often. And so it becomes a front page story. So I'd have to step back and say, the infrastructure is not in terrible shape. There are places where we need to do a better job. And it's not so much what a crisis, as I would describe it, as an insidious problem that goes on because we don't do a good job of keeping facilities and systems in good repair. We are pretty good at responding to crises, and we would do better, and it would be less expensive and less hysterical if we were not so focused on crises, and we could say, look, there's a pattern. We have infrastructure out there that ages and deteriorates from use and from assaults from the environment. We need to invest on a continuing basis. So it's not just a matter of responding to crises. It's a matter of saying, what's the analog? I've got a dog. I've got to feed the dog every day. And if I wait until the dog is severely underweight and in bad health, I haven't managed the dog well. And I've got the same issue with infrastructure. So if you'll look at both in the Biden plan and in the ASCE report card, a lot of focus on backlog, that it's work that should have been done that needs to be done. Well, we would do better if we were investing more continuously at a higher level than we are now, rather than dealing with these issues as crises. The thing that ASCE does for us is it kind of puts a crisis emphasis on something that's an ongoing and insidious problem, on the argument that that's the way to get attention. And what I would hope is that we could find a better way to get attention by managing these systems more thoughtfully on an ongoing basis.
Because I work in data, Dr. Schofer, a comment that you sent over to me, you've mentioned the importance of data. You've studied infrastructure in this country for a long time. So the issues that are out there in the world of U.S. infrastructure, they didn't happen overnight. Nobody walked over to a light switch, flipped a switch, and then we all looked at each other and said, my gosh, there are some issues in infrastructure. So in your opinion, what happened? What didn't happen that got us to where we are today?
Well, I read stories in the paper. I read stories. I do read the newspapers, and I'm tracking whenever there's a major infrastructure disaster. I try to track it to see if I can learn something from it. And I'll see something in a media report that said, well, there's a problem with this bridge, and it's 75 years old, or it's 100 years old, or the Brooklyn Bridge, it's 138 years old. And therefore, that's an explanation of why there's a problem. And maybe it isn't an explanation. But the way I look at it is, well, the Brooklyn Bridge is 138 years old. Last year was 137 years old. The year before that, it was 136 years old. Where were you in those years, and what were you doing? So, to do the right thing, you need the data. You need to know what the condition is. So I don't want to paint my house every 10 years because it's the 10th year. I want to paint my house because the paint has deteriorated to the point where I need to renew it. So it's not an age-based thing. It's not a time-based thing. It's condition. And to know condition, you need data. And we need to collect those data. Now, we're pretty good about bridges because there's a federal standard that says every bridge needs to be inspected every 2 years, biennially. A major bridge like this I-40 bridge at Memphis needs to be inspected annually. Now, what's really interesting about that case is, I'm not in Memphis, I'm in Chicago, and I'm looking at pictures in the media, and there's a crack completely through one of the support beams. The bridge is standing. My limited ability in structural analysis says it's not going to fall down tomorrow, but it was inspected a year ago, and there's a crack in it. I'm looking at the crack, and the crack is thoroughly rusted. And so one has to ask the question: well, did you do a good job of inspection? Did you catch everything? Did this just happen? Now, things can just happen on very short notice. And so if you're inspecting every year or every 2 years, you may be 18 months behind, 23 months behind in finding a problem. In a case like that, where the bridge is really important, then you can turn to technology. And we have a lot of technologies on the books and on the shelf that we can install on a lot of our infrastructure to call you at night on your iPhone and say, there's a crack in the bridge. Well, you better do something about it. So we need to move in that direction and be a little bit, first of all, dependent on data, because data are critical, and maybe a little bit less dependent on sending somebody out to hang on under a bridge to assess the condition by taking advantage of technology. These are things we can do. And what we tend to do, and I think it's a characteristic of people, is we tend to do it after the crisis rather than in advance of the crisis. And we've got to get ahead of the game.
Yeah, very good at reacting, I think, is kind of what you're touching on there. And earlier in our conversation, Dr. Schofer, you mentioned President Biden, the American Jobs Plan. I got out my calculator and I checked $2.3 trillion is a lot of money. If you were put in charge on your list, Dr. Schofer, there in Evanston, Illinois, as far as infrastructure goes, what would be at the top of your list? Which are your priorities? What do you feel are the real problems?
That's a hard problem, and one of the reasons why I'm sitting where I am and I'm not in Washington making these decisions is that I don't have all the data and the information, and I probably don't have the skills to do this. I guess I would offer some really simple responses, and that is, tell me where the problems are. Tell me how important the problems are. That is, what benefit do I create by resolving a problem, and let me allocate the money that way. So one of the things I would not do, which is why I'm not a politician, is I wouldn't try to spread the money kind of evenly over the landscape, but I'd try to hit the major problems, and I'd want to have some confidence that where I'm putting the money is really going to do some good. So what are the issues I need to pay attention to? resilience. So you've got an issue. You've got resilience issues in Texas. You've got some storms, a pattern of storms coming through. You've got issues of resilience in the coastal cities, particularly in Houston. I would start looking ahead and saying, what are the natural disasters that are coming at me? And how can I really best be prepared for that? So resilience would be very high on my list. And part of resilience is getting ready for climate change. I mean, whether you believe it or not, the data say this is coming. And if it's a 1,000-year cycle, and it's, people say, well, we've seen this before. Well, my response to that is, you didn't see it before. You heard about it before. And maybe it is a cycle, although that seems unlikely. But gee, you ought to be ready for a cycle. So I would worry about resilience. I would worry about equitable distribution of mobility, the ability to move around in space, to make sure that people have the capability to do that. I would put resources into the future. So what am I going to need in the future? I need probably to be ready for the electrification of the transportation system, which doesn't mean so much what do I need to do with roads, but it has to do with what I need to do with the infrastructure that supports electrification, which is the electric power generation and grid of the distribution system, and charging stations. Now, I'm not sure that's a government responsibility, but it's a government responsibility to encourage the development of that infrastructure if electrification is where we're going, and it's very apparent that we are. People have been talking about self-driving vehicles. I have colleagues who are spending their careers working on the development of self-driving vehicles, and those self-driving vehicles will come along and they will bring substantial benefits. I don't know how far ahead that will be. It's well into the future. And we need to be thinking about that as we look at congestion, say, on the highway system, and say how maybe self-driving vehicles are going to relieve some of that. Maybe mobility patterns are going to change. Changes in the wind, and I would, were I making decisions, I would call in my advisors who are tracking behavioral patterns of people, that is the people who are consuming transportation and making location decisions, and try to get my finger on the pulse of what the next 20 or 30 years are going to be like before I make major investments, let's say, in building capacity for in the road network or in the transit network. Transit systems, because of COVID-19, are operating at maybe 30-40% of capacity. Will I need 100% of that capacity in 2 years? I'm not sure, but there are people that are studying that and tracking that, and I think we need to be. Just go back to data. We need to see what direction society is going in, and to be prepared for that. So maybe the solution, the way to allocate the infrastructure money, is not to fix up all of the old stuff, but to make sure we fix up the stuff that we're really going to need in the next at least 5 to 10 years.
A lot of important decisions to be made. And as somebody who has delved into this topic on this show for the past 7 years, I guess my question would be, okay, is the will there to get these issues addressed, get these projects off the ground? One important aspect on the show, we've had Dr. Colin Clark on. He's now with the Sue Fan Center. Gary Brantley, the former CIO for the city of Atlanta, has been on, just kind of mentally going through the list. I mentioned ASCE. We've had a couple of guests from there talking about security and infrastructure. Critical infrastructure security has become a topic that at least I have seen in my travels. What is critical infrastructure? And it may appear obvious, but why is it important?
Well, Bill, what's critical infrastructure isn't obvious. Was Colonial Pipeline obvious to you before?
No.
2 weeks ago?
No.
What's critical infrastructure is infrastructure such that when it stops functioning, or when its functioning is degraded, it has a significant impact on society, on the economy, on public health, on security. What is that? It's certainly on the transportation side. It's the network systems that support commerce and our day-to-day activities. The road network, the transit system, the railroad lines. And the railroad lines, I guess let me keep going down the list before I dig back into railroads. But you can also think about the power grid. And by the way, think about broadband, because COVID-19 taught us a lesson that we can do a lot of things that we need to do through communications. So that becomes critical infrastructure. If we take out, I'm sure you have the same experience I have. That I'm spending my day on the internet, and when somebody's computer goes down, everything stops. So, absolutely, the airline network. And what's interesting to me about critical infrastructure is how much of the critical infrastructure in the United States is very much in the hands of the private sector. So the railroads, the freight railroads, 100% the private sector. Pipelines are invisible, but if you go on the internet and look for maps of pipeline networks, they cover the nation, and you've got a lot of that coming in out of Texas. Critically important. Fascinating to me that there were fuel shortages on the East Coast, not because there wasn't enough gasoline, but because of the behavior of people led them to hoard gasoline that they didn't need. Now, that was a situation where leadership could have stepped up and said, no, you don't understand. There's not going to be a shortage. We're going to restore this in a short period of time. And there's a reasonable supply to support basic functions. So you don't need to fill the gas tank of your car or the trunk of your car with gasoline. So railroads, pipelines, electricity production, and the distribution grid, all these are in private hands. Energy distribution, energy production in general, private hands. Broadband, private hands. A lot of the water infrastructure in urban areas is run by private companies, and of course the airline industry. So you're dependent on these, and the expectation is, will these companies really do a good job of protecting their infrastructure? They're, for the most part, publicly held companies, and so they have to report to their investors what their vulnerabilities are and how they respond. And I think they do, generally speaking, a good job. Colonial Pipeline may be a bad example, and maybe we'll learn some lessons from that. But I guess the direction I'm going in is to say, well, don't think the critical infrastructure problem is strictly a government problem. It's everybody's problem. It's the private sector problem. There needs to be collaboration. So there's a role for government to say, well, you've got to perform at this level if you're going to do this job. But where does the money come from? By and large, it comes from private investors, and we want some assurance that those private investors are putting their money in the right place. So everybody's got to make the right decision to keep the system going. I spend my life on infrastructure because I can't get away from it. I look out my window, I get on the computer, I get on the telephone, I fly from here to there, and infrastructure is what makes it possible. The society and the economy are very dependent on that performance. So going back to ASCE, they're doing a really good job. I think they're a bit of a alarmist, and what they need to say it equally loudly is that our infrastructure works pretty well, except when it doesn't. And what does it take to make sure that it works pretty well all the time? It's not crisis response; it's ongoing investment, and that's a behavioral problem. It's a behavioral problem of political leaders. It's a behavioral issue with people. We have a tendency to say, last week we had a 100-year storm, so we're not going to have another 100-year storm for 100 years. I don't have to worry. And life doesn't work that way.
Indeed. Infrastructure is such an important topic. As you mentioned, Dr. Schofer, we're all touched. Each and every one of us touched by infrastructure. It doesn't matter where you live, doesn't matter where you work, doesn't matter to where you travel. So we do appreciate so much, Dr. Schofer, you carving some time out of your schedule to visit with us. I mentioned to you prior to our conversation, we will direct people to your publications, to your Northwestern University faculty page. And I encourage everybody, again, to be sure to tune in to the Infrastructure Show, the podcast as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Very good to talk to you, Bill.
So there again, many thanks to Dr. Joseph Schofer from up at Northwestern University up there in Chicago. I hope trust everybody, found that information to be beneficial as we continue to move along the conversation regarding U.S. infrastructure. Speaking of conversations, and because we are kind of up against the clock, we'll get right to it. Rick, see you over there, partner. I know you've been waiting. What do you have in this installment of Crazy Bids?
Thanks, Bill. So for this episode, our crazy bid comes from Minnesota State Colleges and Universities, more specifically Inver Hills Community College. This is an RFP. The title is Tablet-Based Virtual Reality Room and Interactive Learning Space, including medical mannequins, surrogate patient monitor, and service agreement. So all of that wrapped up in a nutshell basically is saying that Inver Hills Community College in Minnesota is looking for a virtual reality software solution for a tablet so that they can give this to medical students within the college, which really stood out as interesting to me because, traditionally as we know it, medical students kind of need to be in these medical laboratories and interacting with these things person to person, which I imagine is the end game of all this. But if we go with a virtual solution, what they can essentially do is get the practice before going into something like this. And they're very specific with what they want in this RFP. They need mannequins that are basically as lifelike as you could get in virtual reality. They basically need it to look like one. They need to have the like airway system management so that they can do like decompression practices and things like that, just the same as you would be able to do to a mannequin for medical purposes, and like lots of other things. They want to be able to basically work through a ton of different medical scenarios so that they can do this in virtual reality without having to be there in person. And this was really interesting for me just because I thought, well, if this is something that we can ask for and we can implement at the higher education level, then what's to say we can't do something like this that we had always thought was just only an in-person thing and that we can go for in the future, and how accessible this would be to people who maybe, like, due to geography or just like any other limitations, whether that be social, cultural, or financial, anything like that. I mean, now we have the possibility of sending somebody to med school, pre-med or wherever, just with an application that you can have on your tablet. And I don't know, that was just really interesting to me, and I thought I might bring it to everyone's attention. So if that is something that you might like to participate in for Inver Hills Community College, then that is this episode's crazy bid that you can win.
As always, Rick, great job in putting together Crazy Bid. Just to let everybody know, Rick has to do some research to identify and put together that segment, the Crazy Bids You Can Win segment. So do appreciate your efforts in that regard, Rick. Well, that's going to do it for this episode. We thank everybody so much for tuning in, sharing, following, downloading our show, The Big Bid Theory. Please help us spread the word. We are just at the very beginning of Season 7 of the show. Thanks for the emails. Keep them coming. You can email me at bcolhane@bidprime.com. When it comes to Twitter and Facebook, we're out there. You can follow us on Twitter at The Big Bid Theory. My personal Twitter is contract_hunter, and I just said it. We are also on Facebook as well. Also, just a little FYI, we're on LinkedIn as well if you want to head over there. Powered by Bid Prime. That's a wrap on Season 7, Episode 2. Thank you again. Thank you to Dr. Joseph Schofer up there at Northwestern. Who knows what's ahead? Look, maybe later on this season, maybe in Season 8 when we get there, we'll have Dr. Schofer back on to talk about the latest in U.S. infrastructure. Many kudos to Rick Jennings and our entire team here at The Big Bid Theory. I'm Bill Colhane. Until next time, go Gunners, Barracudas, Tigers, Bobcats, and Cubs, and we wish you all the best in growing your business.
Powered by Bid Prime, we thank you for tuning in to The Big Bid Theory. From Austin, Texas, the show is produced by Bill Colhane and Jim Ward. Producer and engineer is Rick Jennings. Distribution, research, and production assistance by Kevin Henderson. You can find other episodes of the show on platforms such as iHeart, iTunes, Spreaker, Google Play, Stitcher, and among others. As always, thank you for downloading and sharing the podcast.
We're having so much fun.